With the end of the Nintendo Switch in sight, I started thinking about the Nintendo consoles that came before, like the 3DS. I even started playing games on it again when I was traveling to Poland last summer, and remembered how fun it was. So I think it's about time we take a look at this old gem, specifically its development, launch, most popular titles, and unique features. So let's jump right in. Development. Our story begins all the way back in the 1980s, because surprisingly enough, Nintendo had been experimenting with the idea of a console using 3D for a very long time. Before the 3DS, Nintendo actually made several attempts to use stereoscopic 3D technology. Their first attempt was in 1987 with the Famicom 3D system, which was an accessory for the Nintendo Famicom that enabled stereoscopic 3D effects, with only a few titles supporting it, like Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally, which was developed by Nintendo and HAL Laboratories and released in 1988. But in the end, the accessory failed to garner any interest from gamers and never released outside of Japan. That's why you never really heard of it. Now, Nintendo's second attempt with 3D came in the form of the infamous Virtual Boy in 1995, designed by Gunpei Yokoi, creator of the Game Boy handheld console and popular Metroid games. Now, most of you have heard of this console. It was a weird portable tabletop system with goggles and a controller that had 3D graphics similar to the 3DS. But obviously the graphics weren't great, everything was red for some reason, and using it was a pain. I had the opportunity back in 2018 at Retro Spielmessen, and man, it wasn't fun. I totally understand why it failed. This was one of the weirdest things Nintendo ever released, and they only made 22 games for it. Now, as you could have guessed, it wasn't very popular. However, the story doesn't end there. Nintendo made another console that was able to create a 3D effect, and I bet most of you never knew about this one, the GameCube. Surprisingly enough, this was a 3D capable system, which I never knew as well. Using an LCD attachment, it could display stereoscopic 3D. However, this feature was never marketed to consumers because they didn't release it to the public. They wanted to use it for the launch title Luigi's Mansion, but the whole thing was scrapped because it was too ambitious. So again, another 3D flop. Now, even though every attempt at 3D failed so far, they still decided to keep messing around with the whole idea. They actually experimented with a 3D LCD again during the development of the Game Boy Advance SP, but the idea was shelved after it failed to achieve satisfactory results. But of course, they didn't quit. Another attempt was made in preparation for a virtual navigation guide to be used on a Nintendo DS at an interactive museum in Japan, known as... this. I am not gonna pronounce that. Then Nintendo President Hiroshi encouraged additional 3D research in an effort to use the technology in the exhibition. But again, the results were disappointing. But still, Nintendo was able to collect valuable research on liquid crystal, which would later aid in the development of the Nintendo 3DS, which started in 2009. According to interviews from Nintendo, they were a bit reluctant at first. 3D had failed many times after all, and they were afraid that it would lose its wow factor pretty fast. But still, they decided to give it a shot, and I will admit, I admire their perseverance. If I was them, I would have given up a long time ago. But for Nintendo, it paid off. In many ways, the time was right, according to Miyamoto. He even said the following in interviews: "The basic elements of the Nintendo 3DS built upon those of the Nintendo DS, so simply updating to the newest technology would naturally improve upon the graphics. The resolution and depictive qualities would go up. In other words, we could create a lot of images and display them. But if we just made a product with evolved graphics for creating pretty pictures, the product would end up being a machine anyone can create. So if we could create lots of images, I thought it would be good to create some for the right eye and some for the left eye. And because the resolution of the liquid crystal was improving, it would be easier to deliver those images to the right and left eye separately. I thought that would fit into the project extremely well. Meanwhile, Satoru Iwata, the then president of Nintendo, said this about it. At the exact time that Nintendo was going to bring out a new handheld gaming device, the quality of images rendered in real time by game consoles had gone up. Liquid crystal resolution had increased, and the ability to deliver separate images to the left and right eyes had all improved. So there was no question that the time had come. First, we decided to see how 3D images would look using the latest liquid crystal. Rather than just debating it, it would be better to decide after seeing actual images. So I had them make a prototype of the screen with the liquid crystal that we eventually adopted and at the planned resolution. And when we looked at it, it grabbed our attention, and we were like, let's do it. So the physical revolution of the hardware gave them the idea of going for a new DS that had 3D capabilities, a feature that would make it stand out and also different from the normal DS. But how does it work, you might ask? Well, to quote Toxic Clay from Reddit, the 3DS relied on something called a parallax barrier to achieve its 3D effect. Simply put, the 3DS top screen is sliced into many columns, each one alternating between displaying an image for your left eye and an image for your right eye. In front of the screen is a physical barrier that, when the 3DS slider is slid up, blocks the column in such a way that each of your eyes sees a different set of columns, thereby creating a 3D image. This is why you had to keep the device just in front of your head, otherwise the effect would be lost. Overall, a crazy idea that isn't as complex as I imagined, but the fact that this whole elaborate scheme works is pretty cool. They even experimented with creating Mario and Luigi in 3D, and after that they spoke to the development staff of Mario Kart Wii and asked them if they could make it in 3D, and that went relatively well. All of this made them very excited about the concept, and in their eyes a new handheld console would be perfect for this, because they would provide the player with a screen after all. And so they doubled down on that, and this whole concept had to work without requiring glasses, because this would lower the amount of people that would actually use the 3D feature. But they ran into a number of issues as well. Creating this 3D effect required them to render two images on one screen, one for the left and another for the right eye. So it's like having to display two screens. So they had to render the upper 3D screen at twice the usual speed, and they had to adjust the hardware for this as well. The 3DS had to be powerful enough. Now originally the processor, graphics chip, RAM, etc. weren't even designed for this. So the development team had to deal with some tight deadlines when it came to showcasing the console at E3. But they also ran into another issue. Because the 3D screen has to deliver separate images to the left and right eyes, the amount of light delivered to each eye is halved. So in order to make it just as bright as usual, they had to increase the brightness of the backlight, which increases the amount of power that the screen uses. Really, their biggest battle was power draw. The 3D effect was very taxing on the battery, but using some tricks like a special power saver mode, they were able to maximize battery life. Now the second challenge with the 3D was people's eyes. For example, the space between people's eyes differs, which is a bit of a problem as you can imagine. And so during the development they decided to add the 3D slider so consumers could make adjustments or turn it off completely, which also allowed game developers to do whatever they wanted without being forced to use the 3D feature. But this wasn't the only 3D feature that the console had. They also added two cameras to the 3DS, allowing people to make 3D pictures, videos, and interact with augmented reality stuff, which was actually a massive challenge. And that's because in order to make a proper 3D photo, the optical axes for both cameras have to be perfectly aligned and facing the same way. The precision necessary when compared to having just one camera is completely different, and this was actually their biggest problem during production. Really, it was a massive hassle, but they did succeed in the end, and so the console was jam-packed with 3D features, alongside some other stuff like gyro, which was actually great in games like Ocarina of Time 3D. And so, the 3DS was born! A handheld console that was an evolution of the DS and years of experimenting with 3D that finally paid off. Really, it was an impressive feat. Now obviously, I've left out some details about the development that weren't too interesting. The only other little tidbit I found in interviews that is still worth mentioning was the fact that they considered to make the system modular, to an extent. When they were messing around with the circle pad and D-pad placement, they considered the idea of giving consumers the option of swapping them. So if you wanted the D-pad at the the top and the circle pad below, then you could just switch them out without much effort. But they scrapped this idea, which I'm actually quite sad about because I love technology that is modular. It allows for more customization and easier repairs. Now in February 2010, video game website Computer and Video Games reported that a select handful of Japanese developers were in possession of software development kits for the Nintendo DS successor, with the Pokémon Company given special priority. And that same year, they unveiled it at E3 with this funny little trailer where Miyamoto and Iwata are sucked up by the 3DS. Meanwhile, Reggie really seems to enjoy it until he doesn't.
You're going to Brazil!
They actually made a bunch of weird commercials like this during the lifespan of the 3DS. So, let's have a look at some of the best ones. Ad time. When you look at the marketing of the 3DS and the games on it, you will quickly realize why that generation of consoles failed so miserably. Nintendo's advertising campaign was a bit, awkward for the most part. A lot of them just show off gameplay with someone enjoying the game, while a lot of the others were overly family friendly or just straight up cringe. We saw a similar thing with the Wii U. I find a lot of these ads incredibly boring. Sure, they show the game and all that, but most of them are very forgettable. And if there's one thing you don't want, it's that. You would rather have an advertisement that is annoying because at least people will remember it. But there are also some ads that are more interesting, like this cringy Valentine's Day advertisement that is quite jarring and not funny.
And hand grenades.
Fireballs and Tanuki tails? What up?
Cruise of terror.
Dude, flying ships and...
bullets with faces.
Yeah, like I said, this wasn't Nintendo's marketing division at its best, and making an advertisement with Big Time Rush didn't save them either. Again, it wasn't too special or interesting, but luckily enough, they also made some crazy advertisements in Japan. I mean, of course, where else? One of the best examples I could find was this Super Mario 3D Land commercial filled with sudden jump cuts, a hyperactive Japanese man dressed up as Mario, and literally 0 seconds of gameplay. After seeing this ad, you don't know anything about the game, but hey, at least it's memorable. But out of all the advertisements for the console and its many titles, which one stood out the most? Well, obviously all the advertisements for the N64 Zelda remakes, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask 3D. For Ocarina of Time, they made a bunch of badass commercials that really made you feel like a medieval hero, and they were also very similar to the original ones when the game came out on the N64. However, the best ones out there are for sure those with Robin and Zelda Williams. They are both epic and immensely heartwarming. I still tear up when watching these. Apparently, Robin Williams had been a Zelda fan for decades, and he and his wife even named their daughter Zelda because they were playing the game around the time she was born. So they were actually perfect for the marketing campaign, and I think it was also incredibly effective. Meanwhile, for Majora's Mask 3D, they made very fast-paced and crazy commercials that truly embodied the game itself. When playing, you have a time limit, and in many ways, Majora's Mask is a weird fever dream filled with death and sadness. Now, I don't like these as much as the Ocarina of Time advertisements, mostly because they lack Robin and Zelda Williams. But still, they do fit well within the game, and the strange aura they have makes them very memorable in my opinion. But how did the console perform when it finally launched? Were the 3DS and the games on it a success? Well, let's look into that. Console launch and titles. Now, the system was fully revealed at Nintendo's conference at E3 2010 on June 15, with the first game revealed being Kid Icarus Uprising, and several other titles from third parties were also announced, including Kingdom Hearts 3D, Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater 3D, Assassin's Creed Lost Legacy, Resident Evil Revelations, and Super Street Fighter 4 3D Edition. And of course, Nintendo also showed off a bunch of stuff they were working on, like Mario Kart 7, Animal Crossing New Leaf, Life, Star Fox 64 3D, and The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D. So loads of great titles were coming to the console, but that wasn't the only thing they focused on during their presentation. Nintendo also demoed 3D trailers of movies like How to Train Your Dragon and Tangled on the 3DS. Really, they were taking full advantage of the 3D craze that was going on during that time. And surprisingly enough, they didn't even plan for it. According to Nintendo, it was a coincidence. They were experimenting with 3D and made a console around it, and meanwhile, the world of cinema was also becoming interested in the idea and pushed it heavily. I mean, Avatar is still the highest grossing movie in history. So how did it go when the console finally hit shelves? Well, not great. The Nintendo 3DS launched in Japan in February 2011 and March 2011 everywhere else, and it was priced at around $250 worldwide. Now, according to Nintendo, launch sales for the handheld in the US were the largest of any Nintendo handheld device in history. It was also one of the fastest selling consoles in Australia, with 200,000 units sold in 37 weeks. And by March 31st, 2011, worldwide sales for the Nintendo 3DS reached 3.61 million units sold. Unfortunately though, these numbers were short of the 4 million unit goal that Nintendo projected. Actually, if you look at the sales numbers, then you can see that the 3DS wasn't doing that well. The DS, for example, sold 5.27 million units in its first year. Now, the main reason for this was the lackluster launch lineup, and as expected, the 3D gimmick wasn't too popular. To be honest, I barely knew anyone that actually used the 3D effect most of the time. And so they had to do something drastic. They had to cut the price of the console. On July 28, 2011, Nintendo announced that the 3DS would be getting a price cut of almost a third of the console's original price, from $250 to $170. This was quite an insane move. Companies rarely do this, but luckily enough, Nintendo had some wiggle room in their margins and were able to do this. According to research from iSupply, it cost about $103 to make a 3DS. But this doesn't take into account stuff like marketing, software, research, and other costs. It's just the hardware. But still, they were able to cut price a lot, and man oh man, sales exploded higher after this. In 2012, they sold 13.5 million handhelds in 1 year, which was even higher than the DS back in the day. And these high sales numbers continued for a number of years, although they never reached the highs of the DS. Now, aside from the price cut, the release of new games also helped boost sales, especially Mario Kart 7, all the Pokemon titles, Animal Crossing, and the Super Mario titles helped push sales, with each game selling at least 10 million copies. They were even able to beat PlayStation, who also released their own handheld at the time, known as the PS Vita. Now, of course, they also made a bunch of different models, just like they did with the normal DS. Rumors of a larger model of the Nintendo 3DS being in production appeared during June 2012, with Japanese publication Nikkei writing an article stating that the system was initially scheduled to be unveiled at E3 2012. However, Nintendo responded that these rumors were false, and that the article was just speculation, but they refrained from further commenting on the subject. And on June 21st, 2012, the 3DS XL was announced during a Nintendo Direct presentation, being sold for about $200 worldwide. So they sort of lied. Sure, it wasn't at E3, but still. They even made a 3DS without 3D, which didn't make much sense, but it did allow them to sell the console for less. And like I said, the 3D element wasn't very popular. And of course, at some point, they also released a new version of the console, which had several improvements, like a little nub that acted as a second analog stick, a slightly bigger screen, and more. That is actually the model I own. Due to this generation being a bit of a flop, I only got my hands on the 3DS super late. So what do I think about this weird console with a gimmick that was just as short-lived as the motion controls of the Wii? Well, let's talk about it. My personal opinions. Around 8 years ago, I went on vacation, and when I was visiting a city nearby, I saw a small video game store that caught my attention. Inside of it, I saw a second-hand 3DS that they were selling, so I bought it together with Majora's Mask 3D. I mean, that is my favorite Zelda game after all. And I played through the game during that vacation, although the amount of time I had was a bit scarce. One thing I can remember is that I rarely used the 3D effect. Most of the time, it was just too much, or could even make me nauseous, which is actually a thing I heard from a lot of people back then. The 3D feature was fun for a hot second, but quite quickly you turn it off and never really touch it again. Now, to be honest, my 3DS collection isn't massive. At the moment, I only own Ocarina of Time 3D, Majora's Mask 3D, Pokemon Sun, Super Smash Bros., Rayman Legends, A Link Between Worlds, and Monster Hunter 4. And that's because aside from the 3DS, I also owned its biggest rival, the PS Vita. I actually bought it before the 3DS. So, which one is king? Well, this is a hard question to answer. The 3DS and Wii U era was a weird time for Nintendo. They thought that as long as a console had an interesting gimmick, then it would sell. They saw that with the previous generation after all. The Wii and DS were massively popular with the average consumer, but real gamers weren't massive fans of them. In general, people lost interest in the Wii quite quickly. We can see this in the sales, but Nintendo hadn't noticed this. That's why they went in with a similar approach for their next console, which ended in disaster for the Wii U. But they were able to save the 3DS. By dropping the price, they were able to undercut the PS Vita, and I bet that this was one of the main reasons why PlayStation lost the fight. Meanwhile, those poor sales figures only made the situation worse for the PS Vita. It is one of the main reasons why its library is so small. Now, I will admit, I like the PS Vita a lot. It's a solid console that you can also mod quite easily. I did that with mine as well. But in the end, the 3DS is the better console. It was well designed, has a better battery life, gyro aim was life-changing when playing Zelda games on it, and the circle pad joystick is still one of the best analog sticks on any handheld. However, I have to admit, this console also has some issues. The 3D and AR camera features are kind of pointless. The amount of money and time Nintendo spent on adding those features to the 3DS was crazy. However, it didn't matter. Almost everyone I knew never used those features. And later on, Nintendo even started releasing versions of the console that didn't have these features. And these 2DS models sold incredibly well. I mean, near the end of the console's life cycle, you could get a 2DS with a game for just $80. Who wouldn't buy that? So I get why the 3DS was a success compared to the Wii U. The competition was taken care of with a price cut, and later models became even more attractive due to even lower prices. Meanwhile, the selection of games on the console was pretty solid. Especially Pokemon, Super Mario, Animal Crossing and Zelda were immensely popular. But what would I change about it? Well, obviously, I would get rid of the AR cameras and the whole 3D feature. This would allow Nintendo to make the screen bigger, improve graphical quality, or boost battery life. Aside from that, it would have been great if the console came with 2 analog sticks instead of 1. Sure, the new 3DS came with a little nub that acted as a second stick, but still a full-on analog stick would have been better. Because while the Circle Pad Pro is cool, it is another accessory that you need to get your hands on. But hey, you don't always get everything you want, and overall, I still love the 3DS, especially the Zelda games they released on it. A Link Between Worlds is still my favorite 2D title, and in my opinion, a clear improvement over A Link to the Past. So, from time to time, I still pick up my 3DS to experience that magic all over again. And years from now, I will still remember it. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to like and subscribe and click the bell button. And if you have any video ideas or whatever, leave them in the comments and you might get featured in a video if you have a good idea and I make a vid on it. Okay, bye.